I mean, that's the pragmatic advice I often give to my mentees who are like, when they describe to their situation, hey, how do I level up? And when I hear the rest of their context, it almost immediately jumps out as, no, I don't think you have a hope here.
For today's Hello interview, I'm really excited to introduce Ritendra. Ritendra is the head of applied AI at Databricks. He's also worked at Meta as a director responsible for video recommendations, and then as a senior staff engineer at Google. So really excited to have you on the channel, Ritendra.
Thank you for having me.
I guess let's jump into some high-level discussion. You've been in the industry for quite a while and seen a lot of different companies. I think over the last, say, decade, there's been this very big shift. I think it started with COVID and it leads up to now in really the vibes of the industry. I think some of this started with a series of layoffs, the RTO fights that are happening in companies, and just trying to figure out what is the new order for tech. I'd love to get your perspectives on this. What's happening behind the scenes, especially amongst leaders in these big companies that are driving all these cultural changes?
In general, the big shift has been driven by AI and how AI has changed the way people work. We are seeing a huge amount of code being written by AI. And at the same time, we're also seeing some amount of like post-COVID sort of drop in engagement among new employees. So if you take those two, like, okay, on one hand, you have a bunch of AI assistant that everyone has access to, which makes their coding faster, cleaner, better, and all of that. On the other hand, employees feel less engaged because they're not meeting people face to face, specifically post-COVID. So I think like those two are the biggest forces. Like, where are you going to be working out of, and what kind of technological help are you going to get when you're building software? So in some sense, what's happening is the easier stuff is going to keep getting served by AI, and the harder stuff that requires in-person collaborations and all of that might be the main reason why we have human software engineers rather than machines doing everything, because there's a lot of incredible amount of subjectivity in what we build, how we build it. And so AI is not at that level. Like, if in some sort of hierarchy of increasingly complex AI problems, the AI of today is still very much following instructions. Tell me what you need and I'll do it. It's not actually creating those instructions on its own. Sufficient amount of time to really replace human actions that are sort of at that higher level of like, what should we build? How should we, prioritize A versus B? What is our strategy for the next 6, 12, 18 months? So if you just take that all together, we're in a world where there's this opposing forces of use more AI, but also have more human interaction. So it's a somewhat polarizing, right? Like, on one hand, you're saying, okay, you have like an assistant that does everything for you. But then the problem is, like, if that is doing more and more of that, like, your value proposition as an engineer in tech is to like figure out what is it that you want to do. And for that, being in isolation is harder. And I'm not saying I'm not sure about this in-person versus, physically in-person versus virtually in-person. I don't have a strong opinion on that.
Okay.
But I do think that engineers that communicate better and collaborate better with others are going to be able to ask those right questions better. And that's something that you can't do by sitting in isolation and doing things, because that value that you bring by just figuring out the difficult coding aspects of what you do is no longer such a big value prop, because you can always like get a machine to do that for you. So that makes sense.
Yeah, I think it does. You feel like a lot of this is actually driven by really the response to GPT-3 in some respects. Because I guess another interpretation that I've heard floating around is that all of these companies were just waiting for this moment where they'd be able to push on efficiency and kind of pull back some of the benefits that software engineers have enjoyed over the last decade. And then this economic weakness had just given them an opportunity. But you're saying, actually, no, the job of software engineers is changing in part from technology. And this shift that we're seeing inside bigger companies is largely a response to that. Is that correct?
I mean, my feeling is that software engineers are all going to level up. I mean, that's the expectation. I mean, what does it mean to level up? It means that, the very low level things that you used to get paid for is going to be done by machines. And so you have to level up at the same, you have to effectively level up in that sort of, in one semantic or two semantic layers above where you used to sit at the same level of job level, um, that's kind of what I'm trying to say. Like, I think, is it reducing employability? I'm not sure. I think it's definitely reducing. It's going to eventually reduce the number of jobs at the low level. But I think there are many competing forces that will decide the total market, right? So it's like the efficiency with which people can, like software engineers can build software, competes with the increasing, like, number of different problems that need to be solved with some software.
Sure.
And it's very difficult to imagine that this is not going to have an impact on this profession.
You said level up there, and I think there's a lot of interpretations, and you sound like you're in a really good position to at least forecast for us about what this means. I think one interpretation of leveling up is like along the traditional career axes. And in a lot of companies, that means becoming an architect and being responsible for bigger decisions or aligning teams. I think this could also mean, taking on more like product style responsibilities where you're instead more responsible for shaping the direction of the business or the product. When you say level up in this context, what did you have in mind?
I'm actually talking about the latter, where you are going to be much more responsible for the higher level purpose of the software you're building. I don't know actually the economics of, like, basically at the same level, professional level or salary level, whatever you call that, people will expect the leadership in these companies would expect more from you as it pertains to understanding the software that you're building and being much more aware of, like, the implications of changing the software a certain way or building new features, because the just writing simple code that would just make something happen is just not going to be a thing that they'll hire people at your level for. So what are you going to be valuable for? You're going to be valuable for deciding the next level of at the next level of whatever you call it, complexity, or next higher semantic layer of how you see the software, right? Okay, what is this for? Who is the user? Like, people will, like, engineers at the same level as they were like 5 years back are now going to have to understand the life cycle of that software, the critical user journeys of the software much more than they used to, because why else would they hire a human for that role?
Sure.
Software engineers will have to be exploit their human-like characteristics more on their job, like
Interesting.
things that are more difficult to replicate. So I'm sure your various traits and your various qualities fall in in different buckets of, like, how replaceable is this skill. So, like, if you look at that distribution of, like, easily replaceable to much more difficult to replace, your distribution has to shift to the right. Your skill set has to shift to the right in that sense, right? So you should spend less time doing things that machines can easily do in the future, and more time honing the skills that machines have very little chance of, or skills that other people don't trust machines to be able to do. Right? Like, it's not even clear if humans are better at judging aesthetics of photographs. It's just the other humans around them don't trust machines with certain tasks.
Definitely. Yeah, I think there's probably
that's a subtle difference.
A ton of. I like the emphasis here, but I guess in my mind, this also kind of aligns with classical career advice that many engineers have received, which is to say, your hands on keyboard, sort of code writing, will certainly get you pretty far in your career, but at a certain point, you need to start to figure out how to influence, be a part of the business, decide on larger direction, design larger systems. So I think in some sense, most engineers are kind of primed for graduating on these semantic layers that you've talked about, but many struggle with that. And I love some of the writing that you have on LinkedIn. You've got a lot of hot takes about management and about leadership. What advice might you give our audience who is sitting in a position where they feel like they could be doing those things, but either their leadership isn't giving them the opportunity, or they feel somehow hobbled by the organization?
This is a very tactical advice, but the one that really resonates with me is communication skills and like how well you communicate gives your leadership the impression that you can think, even though between all else being equal, someone who communicates better is usually given those higher level
Hmm.
tasks, is what I've seen. People judge other people literally, and they don't have enough time to evaluate others. So then they evaluate them based on the few sentences that they exchange with them. Oh, this guy seems really good, or this girl seems really, yeah, insightful. Like that's it. Like based on like 10 sentences that they exchange, like immediately people pass judgment. And especially leadership, part of leadership's job is to judge whether we like it or not. That's the job. Like, or constantly evaluating who's good, who can do this task, who can lead this area, who can sort of communicate to the CEO, who can build partnerships between teams, who can resolve conflicts. Like constantly that's what we're doing. So if you want, like, those are all higher level tasks than sitting in a corner writing code for a well defined
Mm.
problem, right? So I would say like working on your communication skills, not just, this is not just pure English or whatever language you speak, but it's about like what do you speak about, and with how much clarity and confidence can you speak about that is a very tactical way to sort of level up, in my opinion. Again, this level up is more around the level up that we just talked about, right? Not just getting promoted, although that could be an outcome of this. But the main thing is like, instead of telling you, can you write this code or can you fix this bug, to can you take charge of this area? Can you tell us what we should do here? That's the level up I'm talking about. Like going from less like concrete technical tasks to like more abstract, higher level missions, right?
Yeah.
So if that
I
makes
think it
sense.
does. Yeah, and the emphasis on communication is really kind of tractable, at least for most.
The communication is necessary, but it has to be preceded by deep thinking
Hmm.
around products, because you can't communicate meaningfully, especially the highly perceptive leaders around you. They'll judge the content that you're talking about, and like what kind of surprising elements are you bringing to the table. That means that you can bring a fresh perspective that even that leader doesn't have. So not only do you want to communicate well, but you should precede that by studying the problems that you're going to talk about in a level of depth that you sort of haven't planned on before or haven't done before. Like I love to think in terms of like, okay, here is a problem. I'll think deeply about it, and when I feel like I've thought deeply enough about it, I'll go deeper.
Hmm.
It's like going down a mine and then seeing if there's another hole that you can go down
Keep digging.
further. I like that analogy.
It sounds like becoming an expert and communicating well are kind of two of the tactical pieces. Some of
Yeah.
what you've been saying has been really about this shift in the style of work. But I think for a lot of engineers, they originally get into software engineering in particular because they're fascinated by the technical challenges. And there's no doubt going to be technical challenges in the horizon of increasing difficulty. What would you say for an engineer who really wants to stay in that zone? How do they continue to level up and be more effective, especially in light of the advances in AI? Is it that they've got to find a company that's working on these kind of frontier problems, or is it that they need to change their approach where they're at?
I mean, honestly, let's be really honest. There are going to be companies where the only way to level up is to like do a few things, like manage people or, do all this kind of like presenting to senior leaders. So there's a narrow way of like leveling up in terms of levels and all that. So definitely in some cases, if you're in a company that's somewhat like traditional with how they grow people, you do have to find a new job in a company. I mean, that's the pragmatic advice I often give to my mentees who are like, when they describe to their situation, hey, how do I level up? And when I hear the rest of their context, it almost immediately jumps out as, no, I don't think
Mm.
you have a hope here. The kind of work you want to do, the kind of deep technical work you want to do and continue to do, is not going to be appreciated at this company that you're at. So your only bet is, the only pragmatic thing to do at that point is to like find another employer who would respect that the depth Put another way, there are jobs where the depth is appreciated. There are jobs where that depth is like you flatten out at
Sure.
some level of depth in terms of technical excellence or technical depth or technical complexity. But if you are at a company where increasingly complex problems exist and you are not really solving those problems, you have to find
Hmm.
a way to get there, to take on bigger and bigger challenges. And how you do it is, again, I'll go back to my old friend communication. So you do have to communicate to some extent that you can lead increasingly complex problems so that people can trust you with those problems. And you have to assume good faith effort on the behalf of your leadership to find the right problem for you based on what they know. So you have to make them know more about you by telling by showing them that you're capable of doing more than what you're doing now through various, I mean, again, it doesn't have to be verbal communication. You can also write increasingly complex design documents about the work you're doing that shows your level of depth in your thinking, so that somebody can bet on you for the next level of complex work. So step one is make sure you're at a company where the depth, complexity, all of that is appreciated. And second is, once you're there, or once you've made sure that you're there, make sure that you're also like, you can be entrusted, you're giving enough signals that you can be entrusted to solve increasingly more complex technical problems. And by the way, it's not always going to be purely technical problems. Some of this is also going to be people, some combination of technical and people problems, because almost I've never seen a case of increasingly more complex problems where people problems did not emerge. It
Yeah.
happens everywhere. Whenever you're solving increasingly more interesting problems that your top leadership cares about, there will be hungry, like hungry wolves. There'll be folks like, looking to have a piece of it, right? And so there you'll deal with that complexity. You have to find smart ways of sort of dividing and conquering, or finding your niche or something like that. But there's almost, at least in software, maybe in certain very technical areas of software or hardware, that you can just do increasingly harder things in complete isolation of the people around you. But I fail to believe that complexity that is necessary to level up in software does not
Yeah.
involve people. It's if you're constantly asking help from a manager or a colleague or something to help you solve, you'll sort of plateau at some level, because they'll be like, okay, this person needs babysitting around harder problems. That's not something that they'll be. This is a blocker for
Yeah.
your career growth.
The people aspect you can't remove entirely from the picture. And it seems like the advice
Yes,
for you
yes,
is, if you're in a company where you're just not getting that technical opportunity, that it's probably an imperative that you go find that position, because the sea is
correct.
rising. And then for those that are in a reasonable position but maybe not getting that work, then you come back to this idea about communication, kind of finding sponsorship and figuring out how you can start to work on those problems.
Yes, yes, and you sort of, people are like, the thing I find people surprised by is the amount of people problems they have to
Hmm.
deal with as they go up. A lot of time people just say, I'm not going to grow beyond this level because I don't want to deal with that. So that's your choice. If you have to like always rely on just increasingly more technical complex problems to in order to grow in your career, there will be a time when you'll be at a crossroads about whether you want to take on that, like, because it's a zero sum game. Like, one overly simplistic thing I like to think about is, when you're solving infinitely interesting problems, you'll get zero pay. And if you're solving extremely terrible problems, you'll get like the like
Hmm.
infinite amount of money. So like we're all straddling that sort of that those two extremes. Like we're moving like left and right of it, because that interesting, I'm assuming, is correlated with
Sure.
like demand. Sorry, supply of talent who's be willing to do this. Like, for example, AI jobs. Like, the number one thing people tell me is like, oh, I want to get an AI job where I'm training a model. That's the number one thing.
I love to
Like,
write the
I'm
PyTorch
training a
code. I
model.
must be
Okay,
writing the
that's
PyTorch code.
I love to do that. Yes, you have to be. If you
Of
don't do that,
course.
it's not real machine learning. So the demand for that is so high that they can easily find someone who
Hmm.
will just do it for
Interesting.
cheap. But and you almost think like it's the opposite. But like people who can train a model following some instructions versus people who can fundamentally innovate modeling through deep expertise is very different. So the pay band there
Totally.
would be very wide. But just wanting to train a model, people will work for less because they get to do it. So it's a I think it's quite flawed what I just said, but it's an
Yeah,
interesting
it's a model, I guess.
way to think
And
about
I
this. Yeah.
think I've always seen it
Yeah.
most acutely in the games industry, where everybody wants to become a game developer. A lot of people do, and as a result, the working conditions generally aren't that good. I think most game industry veterans would agree with
Not
that.
good. Yeah.
You've you've kind of painted a picture, though. It sounds like there's some urgency for people to be just gradually elevating, the level that they're operating at, and in some respects, that people might be mispositioned. That where they are now is not going to take them there. That means that a lot of people are theoretically looking for a shift. They're either looking to move into more technical roles or maybe up that semantic pyramid that you talked about. What, in your mind, is kind of the key for people in making that transition?
A lot of education is going to be involved, and that I
Hmm.
don't mean formal education, like learning to do new things that you have not done before, being in a very uncomfortable position for some time till you become comfortable, using that skill to interview well at these companies where interesting work is happening in that space, or even like showing in your current company that you can do new things that the company is not working on. Because this is a very sort of, we are all learning, like especially in this AI space, we are
Right.
all learning every day. It's a very sort of learning oriented. Those who are just finding new insights and are willing to experiment with whatever they get their hands on are being sought out, because most people, there's not a lot of theoretical basis for what we are seeing out there. So it's not like there's a very well defined book that can be written about like all the things we are learning, but lots of anecdotes are emerging, and we are sort of figuring out like how much of these anecdotes can be generalized into something theoretical, or is it that like there's a bunch of folks who are just going to keep trying different things, and those who are able to try more things are more likely
Mm.
to chance upon something great. And so then you start seeking out people who have the tenacity to learn something and then apply it over and over again till you see something good. And so you don't need any formal education for that. You just need perseverance, you need a willingness to learn, you need a growth mindset, and you just keep doing it over and over again. One of the higher level things you can do in AI today is quality, which means no matter what kind of AI problem you're solving, the initial
Totally.
version of this is going to be shipped. So your job is going to be to make it better, right? So, and this is a kind of thing a lot of people tell me, I don't want to do that, I don't want to keep trying and figuring out. But definitely one way to like level up in a somewhat narrow way is to be an expert at just trying, failing, trying, succeeding, that loop of like trying, succeeding, or failing, and based on that deciding to sort of merge that change into your system, and then trying again and failing, and like going through that loop over and over again till over some period of time you've made a product that was kind of meh to something that's really useful. And so the difference for any given AI product is between how many is like how many different like people were asked to do that for a single product over what period of time. And we've seen that kind of success at Google, at Facebook slash Meta. We're seeing that at like companies like Netflix over the years, where you just keep getting better and better at like quality
Mm.
of AI systems, right? And that's somewhat narrow, but like it just came to me because it's like something that neither requires too much specialization nor requires like being in the right place at the right time. You can just be that person because you're going to be in the
Yeah.
minority of people who would want to do that.
I like the emphasis on kind of grit and tenacity as well.
Yeah.
I think those are two qualities that, over the long run, end up really separating out people who are successful from those who aren't.
I think that grit and tenacity is like very
True.
applicable to scientific discovery in general. And we are in that phase where we don't really understand what we are observing. We are like all literally observing emergent behavior in neural networks. And we are trying to like, I mean, there's no, you're not going to have an aha
Sure.
moment here in most cases. You're going to just keep iterating and finding new local optima
It's a very interesting idea to say we're kind of entering into a newly scientific age for engineering where we have to be more curious.
Yeah, because it's too complex for any kind of theoretical basis.
Ritendra, I've got one last question. I know we're almost out of time. You have this very
Yeah,
contrarian take that I
yeah.
actually love a lot that really emphasizes having side projects and hobbies and not being overly focused on work. And you feel that this is actually a way to kind of, in some sense, get ahead even in the work itself. I'd love to hear a little bit about why you came to that conclusion. I know you have a lot of really interesting hobbies that we could get into and probably won't have time, but tell me why you think this is so powerful.
I think like the big thing is like mental health. I mean, to me, that's the number one reason I have so many hobbies, because if I don't have a good day at work, I can go back and do something else with my art. If I don't have a good day in art, I can come back to work and find some value, because ultimately we are all pursuing feeling valued all the time. I've distilled it down to just that. Like after talking to hundreds of people, by the way, I have lots of mentees, and that's a completely new thing that happened this year when I like started talking to like
Wow.
170 different strangers about their problems. And I found out that this is the number one thing that, at least this is a biased set of people who decide to, choose me as a mentor. The thing that emerges from those conversations is that everyone is looking to feel valued. That's it. Basically, if you then take a step back, feeling valued need not just come from your work. It need not come from your family. It could also come from something else. In fact, with work and family, it feels somewhat like you're expected to do a certain things. Whereas with hobbies, one of the things that happens is with even little effort, you get a lot of validation for what you do, because people don't expect that to be your profession.
I like that. I guess the key here is that for people to have any sort of intensity at work, they need to have, in some cases, an outlet where if they fail, it's not the end of the world. You've got other things going on.
And I would say like two more things. The outlet, a lot of people say, oh, I also play the guitar. But the problem with that is, yes, you're frustrated, you play the guitar. At some point of time, if you're truly
Mm,
depressed at work, you'll stop playing your guitar. So it has to be more than that. It has to be something where you're accountable for delivering something, and you are evaluated on it in some sense without too much pressure, right? In my case, like I'm running a theater production, right? I have to deliver it by a certain date, and people will come and watch it and give me their feedback. And if it works well, you sort of like get a great feeling. It's a warm, fuzzy feeling when that happens. But if it doesn't work well, it's
sure.
not the end of the world, because this is not your day job. So you can sort of go back, you can improve, you can learn from those mistakes, and you can go back and to the drawing board and do it again better this time. And you keep getting better and better.
Ritendra, this is a great way to round out
Absolutely.
our discussion. I love the ideas that you brought to the table, from kind of how to be effective in kind of this new world, the newly scientific economy, how to progress your career, but also how to round out as an individual and make sure that you don't burn out. This has been super informative. Really appreciate the time.